All right. Good morning, everybody. It's Mr. Blood here in the Memorial Park Woods, here to give you just a little bit of a tutorial on how to do a landscape cross-section. Now, what a landscape cross-section is, it's kind of a map of it's like a horizontal map of a part of a landscape, and it's something you would use to show a transition between one type of landscape and another. So you could do this on multiple scales. A large scale example would be something that takes up like multiple miles. Maybe you want to show the large scale transition that happens from, I don't know, like an interior forest down to the lake shore by Lake Michigan. And you want to show how the landscape changes from there. On a really, really small scale, you could look at how the distribution of mosses and lichen on a rotting tree stump changes over the course of a few feet. I'm going to be doing kind of a medium scale one today, but the basic idea is you're trying to capture how a landscape changes from one spot to another. So my first job is going to be to go ahead and search for an interesting transition here in the landscape. So that's what I'm going to do first. I'm going to look around for some sort of interesting transition and then show you my next steps. Alright, so I found kind of an interesting spot here. I found an interesting transition. Some of you guys might recognize this from when we talked about wetlands. But what I found here is the transition from the forest woodland area right here behind me to more of an open wetland slash field over here. So this is the first thing I've identified. This is kind of a cool transition area. That is my first step. The next thing I have to do is draw a elevation profile of how the elevation between these two spots changes over the course of that distance. So I'm going to take a second to get set up and then show you what that looks like. Alright, so I'm pretty well set up here. I've kind of picked out a nice line that I want to do on my cross section here. And I want to show you how I set this up. So here's my page. It probably makes most sense to make your page go horizontally. But you can see at the top it says, I think it's mirrored for you guys, but it says Forest Wetland Landscape Cross Section. And I started my landscape profile, my elevation profile, kind of in the middle here, because maybe it'll go up, maybe it'll go down. The middle is a good place to start. And I drew myself as just a little frame of reference. This is just to give you a little bit of a scale in terms of how much the landscape is going to change here. So you can see I take up a decent amount of this page. So we already know, like, I'm not going to be climbing a mountain or anything. This is going to be some pretty gradual elevation change. So what I'm going to do now is kind of walk the line from where I am here in this little forested area, kind of out behind me to that wetland you see back there. And as I go back that way, I'm going to just be sketching out just the basics of the elevation and how it changes. So I'm going to do that real quick, draw a little bit on my nature journal as I go, and then I'll show you my results. So let's see. Alright, so here is what I came up with. It's pretty straightforward. So standing where I am is pretty much the highest point in our elevation here. And then as I go down towards that wetland, it gradually goes down, and then when you actually get to that wetland, it goes down quite a bit, and you've got this nice kind of shallow bowl in here. So that's all I mean by your elevation profile, like just a little two-dimensional drawing of how that elevation changes. The next thing I'm going to do is I need to start illustrating a little bit of what vegetation we might find in these different spots. So here's what I mean by that. If I look around right where I am, I can get my computer out of here, there's a lot of trees, right? These are all aspen trees. So I'm kind of in this nice, somewhat open woodland right here. But then when I go over that way, it's more of a wetland slash grassland area. So what I want to do on my diagram that I'm doing, my cross section, is find a way to kind of accurately show that. Now I don't need to draw each and every single little tree. That would be a little ridiculous. But what I'm going to do instead is make a key of symbols I can make, or little basic illustrations I can make that represent, like, say this represents an aspen tree, or this represents a cattail, or this represents some of the grass out there. So real quickly on my paper, I'm going to do that and then show you kind of what I came up with. All right, so here's what I got. You have to pardon me, I've got the computer kind of wedged in a tree here, so I just have to watch my head a little bit. There's no other good surface for it. And it's mirrored again. But here's kind of what I came up with the key. I know it's backwards, but the four things I identified as there being the most of is aspen trees, so I kind of just drew a basic tree shape for those. There's a lot of grass. I just drew a couple blades of grass. Way out in the wetland, there's some cattails, so I drew the little cattails with the tail at the end. And then there's a decent amount of just little shrubs down here. And I don't know, it kind of looks like an alien, but I drew this little stubby little thing for a shrub. So what I'm going to do now is start filling those in on my landscape diagram based on where I find them. So I'm going to do that for a little bit. It's going to take me a few minutes, so just bear with me a little bit, but I'm going to start filling in all these different types of vegetation and where I kind of find them. So here we go. Alright, so I've got a basic diagram right now. So here is what I've come up with. So starting where I am, there's a pretty thick stand of aspen trees. So these big tree-shaped symbols right here are my aspen trees. If you look down between them, you'll see that there's some grasses and some shrubs as well. But really the prominent feature is the aspen trees. As we move closer to the wetland, we notice they start to thin out quite a bit. So I started to draw them a little bit more spaced out with a little more grass in between. But then once we get to just a certain boundary, there's really no more aspen trees. There's a handful of shrubs, and then it's all grass going down to the wetland. The interesting thing about that wetland is for the first part of it, I think probably the part that's most submerged for most of the year, there's really not a whole lot of vegetation there. There's some really, really short grass that's in there, but really not much else. And then after a little bit of that, that's where the cattails start. So here's my little cattail symbols right there. And that kind of shows you where the cattails pick up. And actually the end of the wetland is just kind of the edge of the paper right here. So that's a good start. The last thing I'm going to want to do, the last thing I want to show you guys, is I want to add a little bit of quantitative data in there. So I might put in some measurements that just show like when do these different zones start. I don't have any measuring tools with me, but if I remember, one of my easy like small steps is 2 feet. So I'm just going to count off some of my steps and start to put those measurements in there, and then I'll come back and show you guys what I found. Alright, so I'm going to go measure some of this woodland first, and then measure it out back to the wetland and see what I come up with. Alright, so a little bit of measuring, and here's what I found. Once again, you'll have to excuse the backwards nature of my illustration here. It's just the mirror. So I found 3 main zones. I call them the aspen zone, the grass zone, and the wetland zone. A little bit of stepping off here, I found that the aspen zone was about 28 feet wide or 28 feet long. The grass zone was a little bit shorter, it's about 26 feet. And then the wetland was even smaller, it's about 20 feet long. So I just put some basic measurements in there. The other thing I tried to kind of illustrate, and I don't know if it shows up all that well here, is how much the land drops between like the edge of the aspen zone and the wetland zone here. And I got about 2 feet of elevation change there. So just a little bit of an estimate of how far that landscape actually drops. So here I've got a nice little cross-section of this transition here from kind of a forested aspen area down to a wetland. You can do a lot with this. We could always do a little like some species survey, see what's here, how much of it's here. We could do a little wetland survey as well. So there's a lot of different places I could go with this landscape cross-section, but it's a really good start to identifying some of these cool transition areas. So that's going to be my challenge to you guys, is to find a cool transition. It might be in your backyard, it might be in a park. It doesn't have to be large scale like this. It can be as small as like from the edge of your yard, which maybe has like bushes in it, to the middle of your yard, which is basically maybe mostly grass. Or at a park, it could be like maybe if there's a creek, it could be from one side of the creek to the other side of the creek. How does the vegetation change? Or it could be really, really small scale. You can find like a dead log and just do a landscape cross section of a dead log and see like how the mushrooms and the lichen and the moss changes. So there's all sorts of really cool transitions you guys can capture with this, and I look forward to seeing what you can come up with. So good luck.